Okay, so thank you everyone. Pleasure to be here again. And this is our first PICO kind of keynote occasion to mark like the 10th anniversary. So let me do a brief introductory remarks. So first, this talk, this keynote moment is co-sponsored by the Georgetown Global Economic Challenges Network. So Frank Vella has graciously helped us organize this along with UPPER, the United Programs for Political Economy Research. And one heads up / reminder, so this talk is going to be recorded and posted online, so just so that we are all aware of that. So we're going to have the presentation and then questions at the end. But let me say a few words. Introducing Daron is almost like, he really needs no introduction, right? So those of you who are here, if you would need an introduction, probably you came here by accident, right? You're just kind of wandering around, so a nice room. But obviously for the audience who's going to be online, Daron is one of the leading economists of the age. I was just looking up his website, and I saw listed like 41 awards, honors, and prizes, and that did not include the Nobel Prize that he just won. So, but he's not here just because of that. He's here because, as Lohan and I were kind of, and Juan Felipe and Jenny kind of thinking about how we could mark the 10th anniversary of PICO. So, well, this is the kind of the obvious choice because is what the kids would call like a friend of the show, right? So as we saw, like he is like the leading presenter here. But also, this is the first time that he's presenting, obviously as a Nobel laureate, I would say in current value. He was already like a Nobel laureate in present value before. But also, I think this is a prize that kind of validates, I think, political economists. So I think we all felt like, a little piece of that prize because validating political economy as a subject, but also I think Daron illustrates the kind of broad church aspect that I think in political economy we have, which is, this idea that, we're interested in the world as it works, and for that we need to understand the politics, but we're not really about like, oh, this is not, and so on. And as you've seen from the presentations today, I think we take that very seriously. And as we were planning the keynote speech, and Daron and us were talking about it, I think he revealed his true nature as a scholar, because he's like, oh, should we do a broader presentation? No, I'm going to talk about a paper, right? I'm really excited about this project. So without much further ado, Daron, it's an honor to have you here. Please.
Thank you, Felipe. It's great. Great to be here. It's in fact, Laurent stole my line that I was like really happy to be here for the third time, but he already said that and Felipe repeated it. But thank you. This is a fantastic conference. The last time I was here, it was like one of the first conferences I went to after the COVID shutdown. So it was particularly enjoyable, but this one's very stimulating in terms of the papers I have seen already. And thank you, Jenny, Juan Felipe, Laurent, Felipe, and Frank for inviting me. So I'm going to essentially, I'm going to talk about this academic paper, which you can see the title. It's joined with Cevat Aksoy, Ceren Baysan, Carlos Molina, and Gamze Zeki. But I'm going to start with a 10-minute or so broader introduction for why these topics are interesting, drawing on some of my own work and other things as well. And my preference always is to have questions from the audience as I go along, but they tell me because of the recording. So I'll try to finish in an hour or so we have plenty of time for discussion at the end. So, some of the work I have done over the last 20 years or so has been focused on democracy, and I don't want to review much of that, but one question that was vexing was, there were a lot of discussions both in political science and economics about whether democracy was actually good for certain types of outcomes, especially economic growth, public goods, etc. And I think my view there, and it's relevant for what's going to come next for framing it, is that actually the evidence is fairly clear that at least when you take both, it's actually true for the 19th century as well, but if you take the bulk of the post-World War II era, democracies have done very well. And I think you can play lots of games with statistics, lies, damn lies, and statistics, as George Bernard Shaw said, but this is raw data. So what this does is that it takes every country that has democratized, and you can do the same thing for reversals, and it shows very similar patterns. I'll show you that in a second. It takes every country that democratizes, and for the year of democratization is 0, and then it plots the GDP per capita of that country around 0 compared to all the other non-democracies. So you can see two striking things there. One is that countries tend to democratize in the midst of economic turmoil. So you can see that in a variety of ways, and it's a very robust pattern actually. Completely the opposite of what some political scientists have claimed about like higher income actually making sort of democracy more likely, less likely, stability, etc. This is the only thing that seems to survive if you do statistical analysis, that autocracies are destabilized by economic crises. Democracies not so much, but a little bit as well. The second is that after that 0, there are a couple of years of slow growth relative to non-democracies, and then it sort of takes off in about 7 or 8 years after democratization, and the countries that democratize, so this is like a within comparison, they grow quite a bit, but at the end of about 20 years, in the raw data, they're about 20% richer than compared to their estimated counterfactual had they not democratized. Now, this is just raw data, but you could do statistical analysis, and just by throwing some of the lags and doing some semi-parametric estimation, this is what you get. So essentially the same quantitative magnitude, about 20% higher GDP per capita, but just throwing a few lags also makes the sort of bumps smoother. And I said you get the same patterns with reversals. So this just uses only countries that go from non-democracy to democracy. This is what happens when you look at countries that go from democracy to non-democracy, and you get the opposite pattern, a little bit less precise given that in the sample that we're using, which stops in 2014 or whatever, there are significantly more democratizations than otherwise. And if you want to understand what's driving it, here is one interesting country because it's often given as an example of authoritarian economic miracle, South Korea. So these are the residuals. This is from the linear model rather than the semi-parametric model, but you get the same thing. So here on the left, you see the points for South Korea before democratization. On the right, you see the points after democratization, after country and time fixed effects are taken out, and you see the kinds of variation that's identifying this. Countries like South Korea, Brazil, Taiwan, they have faster growth performances once you control for the simplest form of convergence effects after democratization. So it's all within comparison. But here is the problem. This is also, we were writing this paper at the time, and even more so today that I'm discussing this paper, in the midst of a crisis of democracy, or democracy in retreat. So depending on the measure you use, the beginning of that crisis changes a little bit. On the left, I'm showing you the VDEM data, which pools across a variety of measures, and I'll show you more about the VDEM data in the Turkish case in a second. So there, the peak appears to be 2010. On the right, I'm showing you data from the Freedom House, the free category, which rose to about like 50 if you do if you do free or partially free. So essentially, sort of weak democracies are included as well. At some point, more than 2/3 of countries were in the democratic stage, and then since 2007 or so, 2006, 2007, there's been a steady decline. So there is something going on. Why would it be that if democracy actually performs well in terms of economic growth? Well, it could be distributional things. Distributional things are very complicated, it turns out, with democracy, but doesn't seem to be any, I'm not going to show you that data, but there doesn't seem to be a kind of a smoking gun. Democracies tax more, so yeah, the rich may not like it, but it's not a super strong, rich bias against democracy in most industrialized countries, although there might be some more complex things going on. They invest much more in healthcare and education and so on. So it doesn't seem like the distributional effects are there. But nonetheless, support for democracy and various aspects of democratic participation are in decline. So on the top left, it's the support for democracy from the Integrated Values Survey. So this is averaging across a number of measures. I'll show you each of the components in the next slide. On the right is electoral turnout. People are turning out less. And at the bottom, it's data from Funke et al., their measure of populist governments. Populism is a very complex term, so I'm not going to talk about populism in the rest of the paper, but that's just one of the rest of the presentation, but it's just one measure. You can sort of think that people, when they vote, they're also sort of showing some sort of complaint about how the establishment political system is working. So this picture is there to show you exactly the same point that I made on the upper left one in the previous slide. Support for democracy is declining, except that now I'm showing you on the left the measure that I showed there, which is an average across the other indices, and then 4 other indices about army, the democratic system, and strong leaders, and governments without experts or with experts ruling overruling democratic process. And the reason why I'm showing you so that you can see the time pattern of these around the world, which are the bars, and the line on top is the US. And what's quite easy to see is that the US decline has been steeper than the world. So US is actually one of the countries that leads this, and it starts way before Donald Trump. So it's not a Donald Trump phenomenon. So the question is why? What's going on? And I think there are 2 aspects to that question. One, which I'm very much interested in and working in a number of different dimensions, which is why is it that democracies are losing people's support? And second is why is it that authoritarian governments, once they come to power, one way or another, are able to continue to garner the support, despite the fact that, according to our evidence, they're not actually doing any better economically, and they actually have a bunch of costs. So, actually, sorry, I forgot. This is the U.S. also, like a huge decline in the trust. So on the first, this is just a very, very small part of the answer, is a paper I wrote together with a subset of the co-authors, Cevat and Carlos, and Nico Ajman and Martin Fispine, which looks at what determines the support for democracies. And the answer that we find is that democracies get more support when they function for a while and they function well. So if they deliver in terms of economic growth, inequality, control of corruption, providing public services in a decent manner. So part of the decline in the support for democracy is either the reality or the perception that they're not performing as well as people were expecting. Now, some of that is, in fact, they have been failing. The inequality has increased in many of these countries. Economic growth has been not as fast as, say, it was in the 3 decades that followed World War II. Public good provision and some corruption issues have gotten worse, but some of it is also perception. If you ask people, their perception of how well democracy is functioning is actually sometimes worse than the reality. And that's the second part of the that's the heart of what I'm going to talk about, which is in the context of authoritarian countries. So why is it that once some of these authoritarian populist leaders, such as Recep Tayyip Erdogan, whom I'm going to talk about a lot, Viktor Orban, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, once they come to power, their popularity actually increases or endures. And essentially, there are 2 broad views you can sort of define on that. One is that whatever happens to the growth evidence, and the growth evidence that I provided may no longer apply, or it may have more complex things. There might be some heterogeneity that it's actually some countries, that's the average effect. In that paper, we didn't find a huge amount of heterogeneity, but it may well be that we didn't look at the right dimension of heterogeneity. It may well be that democracy is good for growth for South Korea and Eastern Europe and Taiwan and Brazil, but not for, France. So that's why Marine Le Pen will become the next president. Hopefully not, but, quite likely. So that's one possibility. Or, just like what many people have conjectured in the context of the United States, it's all cultural issues or other things. People have an inherent preference for non-democratic governance. So every country gets the government that it deserves, sort of idea. But the second possibility is that people have misperceptions. Chris talked about misperceptions in the context of gangs, but there are also potential misperceptions, and we're going to see them in the data, in the context of what democracy delivers or may deliver, and in the context of what has happened to democracy under authoritarian leaders. So this is what we're going to investigate. And my co-authors are very proper, and in the paper, they have always used Türkiye, which is the new official name, and whenever I write Turkey, they correct that to Türkiye, but I can never say that, so I'm going to say Turkey. Okay, so this is going to be in the context of Turkey and a historic election in Turkey. So we're going to try to answer is, A, from a descriptive point of view, are there important misperceptions by voting bloc on the value of democracy in terms of some of the things that we talked about, and also the state of democratic institutions, whether they have become better or worse. I'll show you in a second. They have become very much worse in Turkey, so it's a leading example of that trend that I showed from VDEM and Freedom House. And then using a large-scale field and a fairly or medium-scale online experiment, we try to understand whether providing fairly reliable information in an objective manner, as much as we can, not partisan manner, can correct some of these misperceptions and lead people to different political choices, as well as bolster some of the interpretation of the mechanisms. So that's what we're going to answer. So here is what I promised. So on the left is the average VDEM democracy score for Turkey. This is, I think, the second worst performance of any country in terms of democracy score over this time period. If you cut the time period, maybe the worst also, but over this time period, this is the worst. And then on the right, you see the components of the VDEM score, and they're pretty much all of them are doing very badly, including media freedom, which is going to be one of the prompts. The election that we're talking about is the May 2023 election, which was a combo, a parliamentary election and a presidential election, or potentially two rounds of presidential election. This was after Erdogan himself changed the constitution to turn Turkey into what Donald Trump is now trying to do in the United States, a very strong executive presidency. Parliament became much weaker. There's no longer any prime minister. So the presidential election is very important, but parliamentary election is also very important, and we're going to look at both of them. And this election was defined as a historic election by much of the Western media, The Economist, New York Times, Financial Times, etc., for a variety of reasons. First of all, this was after 22 years of Erdogan's rule, or 21 years of Erdogan, 22 years of his AKP party, because he was in jail and he was banned from politics when AKP first rose to power, even though he was clearly identified as the leader. It happened while his popularity was waning already, even among some of his natural base. The country has in very dire economic situation, essentially the economy being propped up by government support and various other sort of interventions, and the official inflation was around 70%, unofficially I think probably around 90%. Plus, Turkey, just before the election, or 2 months before the election, had a massive earthquake, which led to an incredible death toll of almost 60,000 people and 1 million people displaced. And the general agreement among all experts is that this was largely because of corruption and the policies that Erdogan himself had propagated, like an amnesty for buildings that were not compliant with the earthquake code, as well as the inflation was very much the outcome of Erdogan's policies, overruling and firing all the central bank governors. In the event, of course, we didn't know this when we started the study. He won pretty handily, although in the second round, with 52% of the vote against 48% for the opposition. So, what we're going to do is, both in the online and the field experiment, and I'll show you the timing in a second, we're going to give people what we think is the best available evidence and present it in various different ways, but trying to essentially, in the most interesting ones, emphasize that this is the best available evidence. It's not a partisan interpretation, but there are going to be limits in the way that I'm going to explain it. So in the online, we're going to do this talking about two things. One is the relationship between democracy and natural disaster. The other one is about media and corruption. Given the context I have defined, these were two issues top of mind to people. And in both cases, there are a number of economics papers that show that higher democracy, better democracy leads to better management of natural disasters, less correlated with lower damage and lower death toll, and free media is associated with lower corruption. Now, I've listed some of the papers, but you may quibble with one or two other, but we're going to present this as sort of a consensus, which I think this is our reading. And then we're also going to present evidence on how, that's what we call the value of democracy. We're also going to present evidence on what the state of democracy, how it has changed, essentially summarizing this picture. But not in one case for democracy, in the other case for media freedom. In the field experiment, there are more constraints on us, and I'll explain how we did the field experiment and how we partner with different political organizations, etc. We couldn't do everything we wanted because we had to work with political parties and their canvassers and their local organizations. We could only do one of them, so we focused on the media corruption one, but also we couldn't dissuade them from doing their more sort of basic campaign that they wanted to do. We could only make some small changes as well as add a subset of what we wanted to do. And then there's some cross-randomization as well, which I'm going to explain in a second. But here is let me just skip the literature review for 1 second, I'll come back to it. So here is the timing, just to sort of both give you a clearer idea of what was happening in Turkey at the time and also where we started doing our research. So it was clear that there was going to be an election sometime between April and July. So we started planning fall of 2022, and in December 2022, and to make this more non-partisan, we contracted all of the parties, and we did so repeatedly, both their national offices and local offices, saying that we wanted to do a study on the value of democracy, people's attitudes to democracy, and at the end, none of the parties that are part of the governing coalition, which I'll describe them in a second, agreed, but the opposition parties agreed. So then we did a bunch of qualitative field work to see which kind of questions were easily understandable by the participants in the online experiment. In the middle of our work, this tragic earthquake happened, which then, of course, changed one of the questions that we wanted to do from just media and corruption and democracy and economic growth to this democracy and natural disasters. And indeed, in our pilots, we found that resonated with people more. And in March, it was announced that the election would be in May. So we started our med dash to do this. And in April 11 on, we started the online experiment. And in April 14, we started our field experiment. And the actual experiment, the elections were May 14 and May 28, and everything was pre-registered, etc. So here is the summary of the political landscape. The incumbent coalition consisted of essentially two parties: AKP, which is Erdogan's party, which is sort of religious right. For a while, it covered the center-right. Whether it is center-right anymore has shifted over time, but especially partly because it's in coalition with MHP, which is a far-right party, so with very strong nationalist roots. The opposition consisted of 5 parties, but really 2 of them were completely dominant. One is the CHP, the classic sort of statist, secular party, sometimes social democratic, often like very strongly statist, but sort of leaning more center left during the last few elections, and the E party, or the Good Party, which is a splinter from the MHP. So it was always in the middle of an identity crisis. Is it a far-right party trying to appeal to nationalist segments, or is it trying to cover the center-right? So in the field experiment, the CHP and the E party agreed to work with us in the 3rd largest city in Turkey, Izmir. The online experiment comes from all over the country. And then we've worked with canvassers that are associated with E party, canvassers that were associated with CHP, and also non-affiliated canvassers. So that's another dimension of cross-randomization. Okay. So here is the descriptive statistics that, in a nutshell, I can give you much more on this, but I think this is going to sort of summarize things in a nutshell. The view of the voters, this is in the online experiment, but we have some baseline in the field experiment that's also very similar, by party of what people think in terms of, or report in terms of their preferences. So on the left, this is sort of, you can think of it as the baseline. It's not exactly the baseline, but it's the baseline for the value of democracy. People reporting whether they would at any time support an authoritarian, non-democratic government. And the yellow is the People's Alliance, that's the governing coalition. The blue is the National Alliance, that was the opposition. And so you can see the big difference that the supporters of the governing coalition are much more willing to say, if necessary, they're willing to compromise on democracy. The gray is the 3rd participant that did not make it to the 2nd round. It's the HDP, the pro-Kurdish party, and they're a mixed bag. They're a strange sort of combination of some Kurdish nationalist elements, some democratic, some non-democratic elements. So we're not going to focus on them, but here I'm showing you that. On the right, we have their views of the state of democracy in Turkey. And This is the other. It's not the state of democracy in Turkey. This is our other baseline question. I thought I wasn't showing that one. There's evaluation, so it's like how well they think democracy does in terms of the 2 questions that I reported: controlling sort of media freedom leading to low corruption, and democracies managing natural disasters better. So what you can see is that the supporters of the governing coalition are less sure of the value of democracy. And I'll show you a different way of that feeds much more directly into our online and field experiment in a second. And that's this figure. So here on the left, what I'm showing you is what they think what's happened to the 2 dimensions of institutions. On the left, it's media, what's happened to media freedom in Turkey. And on the right, it's democracy, the overall democracy score. And as you can see, comparing the yellow and the dark blue, the government supporters think that media freedom has actually improved in Turkey since 2000. 2000 is before the before AKP came to power. And on the right, you see that they think that the degree of democracy in Turkey has improved. On the other hand, the supporters of the opposition in the online experiment report a massive deterioration in media freedom and fairly massive deterioration in the state of democracy. In addition, we are showing with that dotted line what VDEM thinks this is. So on the left, you see that according to VDEM, the media freedom has gotten really bad, not as bad as what the CHP supporters think. On the right, they're actually on the money. They've got it exactly right. So on the basis of this, you can at least start with the working hypothesis, and you'll see that this working hypothesis will receive some more support when we do the experiments, that the governing coalition's supporters have misperceptions about both the value of democracy and how badly democracy and media freedom have been eroded. Now, I don't want to claim, some others may, that things were in any way democratic or free in 2000. They were pretty bad already. So, but this is a deterioration on the basis of that. And the reason, if you talk to AKP supporters, that they would say things were bad and have improved since then, is they think, religious groups were marginalized and were silenced, and that's not true anymore. That's why media freedom is better and democracy is better. So it's a complex story, but we're going to take VDEM as the ground truth here. All right. So here is the exact language that we're going to use for the treatment. And what we've sort of attempted to do here is to provide this in the most, especially in the online experiment, in the most non-partisan way possible. So what we don't want to say is like, we are supporters of CHP and the government has been doing badly in democracy or has been silencing critics. That's not what we want to do. We want to say, democracy has these documented benefits, media freedom has these documented benefits, and look at this data, it's been getting worse. And I'll show you in the field experiment, that's exactly what the flyers are. We can also skip on, show you the information in the, but here I'm not going to do that. So you see the language that we're using to achieve that. We're saying, according to research, so we're sort of appealing to authority. Okay, fine. Every now and then you can do that. And official data show that, where by official data we mean VDEM's data. Now, in situations like this, perhaps not so much in the field experiment, although some people may disagree on that, but experimenter demand effects are very important to be worried about. So to deal with the experimenter demand effects, we do something that in a paper on Pakistan and state and non-state actors, Ali Chima, Asim Khwaja, James Robinson, and I did, which is we provided a placebo where we tried to induce as much experimenter demand effects as possible without providing any real information. So that's what we replicate here. So the language is, although I'm not sure, so this is like really there isn't new information here, I think that as media independence in a country gets worse, corruption increases. Also, some people said that in the last 30 years, media independence in Turkey has worsened. So we're trying to do this, not provide real information, but say that this is our view, so if the experimenter demand effects are induced by what people think we want them to hear, this should induce them. Okay? So I'm going to show you now the results from the online experiment. And essentially, I'm going to do that in 2 steps. First, sort of the channels, how much these interventions change people's beliefs about both the value of democracy and the state of democracy. The value of democracy being, is democracy really useful for these things, as we claimed in our research summary, and how the extent of media freedom and democratic institutions have fared in Turkey. And throughout, all the results are going to be presented in this way. So both in the field and online, the headline results, I'm going to call them bundled, because we're going to take multiple treatments and then put them into, just combine them. That sort of maximizes power, and at the end I'll show you, you're going to see it here, there isn't actually that much heterogeneity between the different interventions. There is some, and I'll talk about that, but at the end, for the headline results, I think it would be a mistake to focus on that heterogeneity. So therefore, I'm going to show you first the bundled, and then I'll unbundle them and show you what they are separately. The left one is for the valuation of institutions, people's beliefs of what institutions achieve. And the first bar is the control. And so you see the control mean. And then the next block is the bundled treatment, the green being the placebo, and the blue being the actual treatment. So the placebo, remember, is the one where we're trying to induce the experimental demand effects without any information. And then the third and the fourth separate the media and the democracy. So in my dreams, what I would have liked to see is that the placebo doesn't get you far. And that's exactly what you're seeing here. So placebo is essentially indistinguishable from the control. So you can see the heights of the everything, by the way, I should have said, sorry, everything is in standard deviation units whenever we're looking at belief measures, but when we look at votes, of course, it's percentage points. So this is in standard deviation units. You see that the two are essentially the same height, and if you have really good eyes, which, you know, I know the number more or less, I don't have good eyes, you can see that the p-value of the green bar being different from the gray bar is very high, so they're not different. Okay, you cannot reject the hypothesis that they are the same. Next, you have the blue, dark blue bar compared to the gray one, where the height difference is 0.07 standard deviation. Not huge, but I think that's good. And you see that being quite comfortably statistically different from the gray control group. Next, if you separate this by media and democracy, it looks remarkably similar. Now, it may well be that people are sort of essentially not distinguishing the media and democracy. They're giving a stock answer. That's why this is, I don't know. In some things, there are some small differences. But essentially, that's the reason why I'm going to show you the bundled treatment throughout. It's not that this heterogeneity doesn't seem to be that interesting. On the right, it's the same thing on the state of institutions. Now, because the state of institutions is getting worse, you would expect the treatment effect to be less than the control mean. And that's exactly what you see with the blue bar being compared to the gray bar. So it's, again, quite comfortably different. So once people get the treatment, they change their mind and they say that, yes, indeed, now my belief is that the state of institutions has gotten worse in Turkey. And again, when you compare the placebo, there's just a little bit in this case, so it's not completely zero, but it's not statistically significant, and especially for media, it's not there. For democracy, there's a little bit of a placebo effect, but much, much smaller, and you can easily reject that the placebo and informational treatment are statistically distinguishable. So summary, what these results from the online experiment show so far is that you take a random group of people, you provide them this information. When you make this information sound objective and research-based, they follow it and they respond to it, and we don't think it's a placebo. We don't think it's a experimental demand effect because we don't see the same thing when it's the placebo. Of course, I think a valid concern is, which we got away with it in our earlier JPE paper on state actors in Pakistan. Some of our referees here are tougher, is that our placebo is too transparent that people can see through. Can never win everything. Okay, so I think, so this shows that as we were intending, when people get the somewhat objective and appeal to authority research-based treatment, they do change their views. So I'll show you in a second who are these people who change their views. But before I do that, so that's essentially like a heterogeneity analysis, now let's look at the baseline finding, which is what happens to their intention to vote. Now in the field experiment, by the way, I'll describe the field experiment in greater detail in a second, we're actually going to look at administrative data. So we'll know exactly whether people change their vote or not. But here it's intention to vote, obviously, it's an online experiment. So the left panel shows a huge, in my opinion, perhaps too big, intention to vote effect. So again, the treatment group that gets the informational treatment becomes 3.7 percentage point more likely to vote for the opposition after they get this information of democracy being valuable and democratic institutions and media having gotten quite a bit worse under the AKP. So that's the blue, dark blue bar compared to the gray control group mean. And again, comparing the green to the gray, you don't see a placebo effect. And once again, now, if you look at the two, there's a slightly more difference, but not much to write home about. Again, I think we are safe in this instance to just focus for this presentation on the bundled treatment. Now, starting to think about mechanisms, there are many, but I think two are natural attractors for us to think about. And those two natural attractors are this information gives fuel to anti-government groups, strengthens their views, makes them more motivated, makes them more likely to turn out, makes them more likely to stick to their guns, etc. The second is that it actually has an effect among the people who had the misperceptions, which are the government supporters, or a combination thereof. So a first look at that before we go to the heterogeneity analysis is what happens to turnout. So on the right, I'm showing you self-reported turnout, zero effect. And we'll see that's actually also true in the field. So this doesn't seem like once you give the information, some groups say, now, armed with this information, we are even more likely to participate. Now, of course, this is average turnout. It could be heterogeneous effects, a positive effect on one group, a negative effect on another group. That's part of the reason why we need to dig deeper into the heterogeneity analysis. But this is the summary of the sort of main effects on the online. People do change their views on both dimensions that matter on the basis of the, and I think by a reasonable amount, 0.07 standard deviation is not too bad. On the basis of that, there's a fairly large 3.7 percentage point increase in voting intentions. Now, I'm going to come back to these quantitative magnitudes once I go through the field experiment, because I think there's something interesting to think about that. But it's better to do that once I do the field experiment. And it's not being driven, there's no turnout effects or self-reported turnout effects. So the next step is I want to look more specifically at who are the people who change their minds. And there are two natural ways of cutting the data, and they give essentially the same answer. One is you cut the data by baseline perception, say, for example, at the median. You could do it in other ways, but we do it at the median. Those who have below median misperceptions or have fairly accurate views, and those who have above median misperceptions. Or you can do it by intention to vote for on the baseline. So is your intention to vote for the National Alliance, the opposition, Nation Alliance, or whether for the People's Alliance, the governing coalition. Since I showed you that it is the governing coalition supporters who have the misperceptions, it's not super surprising that these two give similar results. So let me just show you the ones that do it on the basis of misperceptions. So this is looking at people who have more misperceptions. They significantly underestimate, they above median underestimate the institutional deterioration. And if you compare these numbers to the main effects, these are larger. So the people who have the misperceptions are changing their views quite a bit And if in the next slide, these are the people who don't have the misperceptions. They're not actually responding. So this is a big surprise, because I think many people, and this is where in one place where we should discuss one very important related paper, which is by our co-author Ceren Baysan in the Turkish context, that her paper as well as other papers sometimes find that people are not open to new information that goes against their priors. Here, we are finding something quite different. Again, experimental demand effects are something you should worry about, but we're going to find essentially the same pattern in the field experiment as well. So, and if to the extent that you think the actual voting is not as subject to experimental demand effects, that should be another reassuring aspect. But people who have fairly accurate views on what happened to democracy and what use media freedom and democracy are not responding to our information, much as they shouldn't under a Bayesian or quasi-Bayesian scenario. People who have these misperceptions in baseline, rather than seeing this as a partisan piece of information, they're saying, oh, well, that changes things a little bit. Now, why this difference between Ceren's earlier results and this one? Well, one possibility may be that in her paper, she worked with the CHP, and it was more sort of a partisan information. So when it came from CHP canvassers, and in a way that sort of was perceived, especially in an even more divided election, which was about the constitutional referendum that set up the executive presidency, perhaps supporters of Erdogan overreacted by saying this is trying to manipulate us, and that's why they went in the other direction even, rather than non-response. They actually went in the other direction. The other sort of context that's relevant is the high inflation and the earthquake also shook a lot of the supporters of, or at least marginal supporters of the president as well. So perhaps it's created more room for this type of information to be believable. Then on the other hand, why did he win again? We can talk about that at the very end. So that this is what it is, and it is different and contrasts with Ceren's earlier results in Turkey from an earlier election in a somewhat slightly different context. All right. So this was all online experiment. And the online experiment has the advantage that we can see these channels and the heterogeneity more clearly. But the real meat is the field experiment. So in the field experiment, what we did is that we teamed up with these canvassers in Izmir, and we were able to provide essentially the same information as well as some other information in the form of canvassers knocking on people's doors and either leaving a pamphlet if they couldn't find anybody, or going through the pamphlet through a conversation with the respondent. So this is, as I said, the third largest city, the third largest precinct, and this is the number of total neighborhoods, number of voters, etc. We can stare at it. I think the more important information here is that there are these two treatments, which we called research-based and basic. So the basic is essentially a variation in what these parties themselves were trying to do it. So if we had not teamed up with them, this is what they were going to do. They were going to send the same canvassers essentially to the same neighborhoods, because the only neighborhoods that are excluded here in Izmir, this was a very important election, so the parties poured a lot of money into the places like Izmir, Istanbul, Ankara. So the only neighborhoods that are excluded here are the ones that are too far to reach, etc. So these are essentially the core neighborhoods of Izmir. They were going to do the same thing, and that's also important because my interpretation is that we did not change the electoral outcomes here because they were going to do this anyway. What we convinced them to do is modify the basic one a little bit, emphasizing the issue of media, and also add and slightly more, about more than half of those turn it to more objective, although not completely objective, not as objective as in the online experiment. They did not agree to that, but more objective, less sloganeering than what they were intending. So here it is. So this is the research-based one. You can see the left side is essentially what we wanted. It gives this information, it summarizes it. This is the pamphlet that's left underneath the door if nobody answers it. And this is the pamphlet that the canvassers go through it. At the bottom, you show the data, what happened to media freedom, etc. So it's trying to be as data-driven as possible. But on the right, they insisted that we should also say our presidential candidate choice is Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, which is, the opposition's choice. This is the basic information. This is more or less what they would have done without us. So now the right is the same. The left is more like, let's fight corruption by fighting this government, etc. So that's more or less the translation. In addition, both of them have this QR code, so you can actually scan and get more of the information. So for example, you can get more of the information on what's going on to media freedom, etc. And we had something similar, not with the QR code, by clicking on a link in the online experiment. And both online and here, a non-trivial fraction of the people actually reached it. So people are interested in this information. Not everybody by any means, but a significant fraction of the people reached it. Okay. All right. And then we also did this by canvasser affiliation. The left is CHP, the middle is E Party, the good party, and the right is the unaffiliated. Okay. So here is our estimating model, which also helps us explain how we did the randomization. So the observations we have from the administrative data are, the most granular ones are at the ballot box level. So a number of ballot boxes make up the neighborhood. And in fact, the number of voters by ballot box is more or less the same. So you don't need to weight these results at the ballot box level because essentially you have the same number of voters at the ballot box, at each ballot box. And what we care about is treatment, but treatment's not at the ballot box level, it's at the neighborhood level. And the main reason for that is because ballot boxes are not consistent over time. So we can include covariates at the ballot box level, but we can't trace ballot boxes over time. So we decided it was important to be able to trace so we can see changes. So therefore, all of the randomization is at the neighborhood level. But then we have covariates on the right, so the treatment T is only substituted by N at the neighborhood level, but the covariates are at the ballot box level, so we can soak up some of the variance. It matters a little bit, it doesn't matter a huge amount. Okay? And that Tn is either going to be again bundled, where we bundle the two basic and the research-based treatments, or it's going to be separate, so you can look at the effects of that vector. All right. So here we cannot look at beliefs, so I'm just going to jump and look at the votes, and I'm going to show you 3 votes. Essentially, they tell the same story, but there are 3 votes that we care about: parliamentary election, presidential election first round, presidential election in the second round. The parliamentary election is very different, by the way. So in the parliamentary election, you vote for parties, you don't vote for coalitions. So the way that we're doing it is that we're taking the parties that are in the coalition and then we're aggregating their vote share. So we also look in the paper in the appendix, I'm not going to show them, the results by specific party votes, but that's not super interesting. So again, the same style, gray is the control, the red is the treatment, no placebo in this case. We actually, by the way, tried to convince them to do a placebo treatment. They didn't go for that. So you see that they have fairly precisely estimated positive effects. So the opposition's vote share increases. By how much? 0.8 percentage points. So about 1/5 of the effect in the online experiment. Now, why is that? Why did we have that massive effect in the online experiment and smaller one here? we think the reason is because in the online experiment, everybody in the treatment group got the information. They had to click on it. Whereas here, only a fraction of the people in the neighborhood gets the information. Now, in hindsight, we would have probably preferred that we didn't leave these pamphlets underneath the door, because then the treatment would be conversations. But of course, they wanted to leave the canvasser pamphlets in there. So it's not so clean to do two-stage least squares, but if you do two-stage least squares, this number becomes, rather than 0.8, it becomes 2.2 percentage points. And it's still smaller than the online, but more comparable. So I think the way that I read the 3.7 in the online, therefore, is it's large. It's still larger than what I would have liked, but it's partly because it's like the causal effect of getting the information, whereas at the neighborhood level, it's not the causal effect. It's the intention to treat effect. Okay. All right. So then what I want to sort of spend the next 5 minutes, and then I'll conclude with broader general lessons, is let's look at where this effect is coming from. So the first thing is, just like in the online, but much more interesting, it's not coming from turnout. It's really a very precise zero on turnout. Again, this is average turnout. It could be the impact of some negative, some positive, but it's not coming from turnout. Now, the next thing we would have loved to do is it coming from people who have misperceptions? Well, we can't do that, because we don't know misperceptions at the individual level. We only have it at the ballot box or the neighborhood level. But what we can do, okay, let me skip that. Let me do this, and then let me go back to the other ones. So we could see whether the effects are larger in neighborhoods which were intending to vote for the opposition versus not. So therefore, here we are extrapolating from the online that those who were intending to vote for the governing coalition are more likely to have the misperceptions. So looking at it through those lenses. And here is the remarkable result, which again even more strongly contrasts with Ceren's earlier results. On the right, when you look at the already opposition-leaning neighborhoods, zero effects, small, insignificant effects. On the right, you look at the neighborhoods that were leaning for the governing coalition, you have much larger and statistically significant effects. So again, this is not coming from the strongholds. It's coming from people who were previously, neighborhoods who were previously intending to vote for the opposition. So who were intending to vote for the governing coalition. Now, two other results. Does it make any difference whether you have the research-based or the basic one? So one conjecture would be that people would trust the basic one less because it's more partisan. But on the other hand, it may well be that the basic one is easier to understand. A pamphlet with data, and this is what research is saying, that a canvasser comes and stuffs underneath your door or whatever, maybe perhaps much harder for people to parse. In the event, the two are very similar. We cannot reject that they are the same. The research by one is slightly larger, but not far from statistical significance. So my interpretation would be that I think these two effects that I mentioned are probably canceling each other, but we have no way of knowing whether that's true or not. On the right, what we are showing is that it does also, there are some interesting but statistically not so significant differences between the affiliation of the canvasser. The largest effects come from non-affiliated canvassers, which is interesting, and is consistent with the idea that non-partisanship of the information matters. But E-party canvassers do particularly badly, and that may well be that actually at the end they had some problems, so they actually messed up a few things. So this may be a non-effect, this may be just logistical difficulties that party's canvassers had. And here is the most surprising result. My preference would have been not to have this result, but it is there. We looked at it, so we reported in the paper. 10 months later, there was a local election. So if you look at whether treated neighborhoods, so there's no further treatment, we did not do any further elections, treated neighborhoods voted differently, and the answer is yes. There is almost as large an effect in the 2024 election. So this information, whatever it is having an amazingly persistent impact, surprisingly so. Okay, so what do I conclude from all of this? I think I would say this is very much an invitation to do more research. If indeed there is generalizability here, and I think it's a big if, it says two things. First of all, it says that actually a lot of the political preferences towards authoritarianism are shaped by various misperceptions. And we have a companion paper in Argentina in the Milei election where we find similar things. And second, these misperceptions are at least to some degree open to being corrected with information that's presented in an objective, truthful, and non-partisan manner. Again, it's a big if, because it needs to be replicated and it doesn't cohere with every result that exists in the literature. But if it's true, I think it opens a broader sort of interpretation that, together with our earlier paper in the Review of Economic Studies that I mentioned, it raises the possibility that some of the change in attitudes towards democracy is because of a combination of democracy having underperformed relative to aspirations and democracy appearing to underperform relative to aspirations, for example, because of social media or other information sources that exaggerate the failures of establishments. And some of that is potentially correctable, A, by democracy doing better in terms of its promises, and B, the record of democracy's achievements being more objectively communicated towards people. So now, what that message has, and that's why this is a big if, and I wouldn't say we know this unless one does, other people do, similar experiments in other settings. But the hope there is that this is not like a inevitable shift against democracy from which you cannot recover. And in a country that's as polarized as the United States, you can have people with misperceptions sometimes respond to information, and that information, amazingly, is having this persistent effect as well. So at least there are some questions here that are being raised, and if this interpretation survives, it's much more hopeful about the future of democracy and what democracy can do. But there's only so much we can learn from one paper. So I think that's my 1 hour done. So now I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you. Yes, sir. I think you need to have the microphone because of the online thing.
Yeah, I'm a bit concerned about. If
it's only a bit, then I'm good.
But you find an effect when you're providing this information. Once it's known that it has an effect, maybe it was new, no one was doing it, then like all sides are providing their information and so on. Like, shouldn't the most important thing be like teaching that in school? Like, to all the kids, part of the curriculum, like having some hope that, who is the provider of that information? When is it trusted? Like,
yeah, great question. Absolutely. So, and in fact, that's part of one provisional interpretation, is that part of the reason why people think democracy has completely underperformed is because the failures of establishment have been exaggerated via social media and other channels. So it's already happening, and it may turn into an arms race. Then it may become more important that people can judge what is reliable information, what is not reliable information. And there you can have very bleak outlook. You might say, what we have experienced in the United States or in France, for example, in the anti-vax sort of anti-vaccine issue is that, falsehoods spread as much or even more as correct information. So I think that's absolutely correct. And then whether you can do that, you can fight against that via education, teaching people understand data better, or even indoctrinate people. I don't know where you draw the line. But one interesting thing, there's an interesting paper by a group of computer scientists, some from MIT, on the anti-vax people and social media. And what they find is that anti-vax people are not unsophisticated. In fact, they're better than to pro-vax people in using social media and visuals and presenting data, presenting evidence. So it doesn't prove anything against your point, but it at least says that these people are not irrational, completely uninformed people. They're actually quite sophisticated. Yes, comments? Yeah, we have to use the microphone.
So thank you for the hopeful message. Now I want to run this before Le Pen wins the election, hopefully not. So I had 2 quick questions. So to understand better the difference with other studies, could you leverage the impact of the earthquake? So in the online survey, I guess you have heterogeneity in where people are located, and to look at whether people who were more directly impacted by the earthquake had different priors, or instead were the one responding the most. Because then it will tell us whether it's the interaction of the two that works, or whether only, quote unquote, a earthquake or only a survey would be useful. And then regarding the lower effect on your experiment, could it be due to spillovers? So you're treating one neighborhood, but a controlled neighborhood might be close by and people might talk to each other. And so you could look at whether you have a higher effect by removing controlled neighborhoods that are close to treated neighborhoods. And maybe it would bring you closer to the online survey.
2 fantastic suggestions. I think there are practical problems with both of them, but we should try both. The practical problem with the latter is that we don't have that many neighborhoods. So that's going to be a problem, but we could do it. I mean, given that things are pretty precise, we can probably exclude 20% of the neighborhoods and still be okay. So that we should definitely try, and that's a good suggestion. We should have thought of that. The problem with the earthquake is very complex, because actually the governing coalition did very well in the earthquake-affected areas. And the reason for that is because after the earthquake, they poured in resources and they said, we're committing to rebuild, we're committing to make a lot of transfers, and the fiscal situation in Turkey got much worse as a result of that. But in some of those earthquake places, they had a landslide actually. But we could still do that, but I wouldn't expect to find much there. Yes, please.
Thanks. I wonder if the word misperception is maybe not the best way to think about these groups, right? Because the way that you've defined groups that have misperceptions is they assigned either too high or too low of a score for Turkey relative to VDEM, right? But the way that VDEM questions are worded are very subjective, right? So, I think it's actually entirely consistent to me that people who believe that Turkey is working well in that democracy is working well in Turkey are like, well then, I'll keep voting for the incumbent party because that is the best thing to do, right? And so I wonder if maybe, and this is like food for thought for future experiments maybe, I wonder if another way to kind of gauge the mechanism you're trying to get at is instead of using kind of these like very large words like democracy, I wonder if it would be helpful to maybe build in the definition, right? Be like, strong party competition where there is regular turnover often increases accountability and representation, right? And I think that not only kind of helps to address the fact that whether you have a higher or lower perception of Turkey than VDEM coders is in itself kind of subjective, but also I think it can kind of help address this larger issue, which is that I think that everyday people have very different perceptions of what democracy even is, even more complicated by the fact that a lot of leaders, anti-democratic and democratic, use the language of democracy, right? And they even use procedures of democracy to do anti-democratic actions. And so what democracy even is has become even more kind of hazy. And so I wonder if just using more precise kind of words about the mechanisms instead might be helpful to kind of sidestep the fact that voters might have very different thoughts about what democracy is.
Those are all very good suggestions. Let me just clarify one thing. Perhaps I wasn't sufficiently clear on this, but we're defining misperceptions on a one-sided manner, given that there were, the opposition members were not overestimating the extent of decline in media freedom. Whenever you are below the median in terms of your views, we define you as not misperceived, and whenever you're above the median, we define you as so misperception is capturing more of the AKP. We could try to do it two-sided, and the reason why we're calling it misperception, we may have changed our terminology if we didn't find a sort of a quasi-Bayesian type of effect that people with those views, when confronted with what we claim to be the objective evidence, change their views. So that's exactly in line with people are using the truth to update their baseline prior. Now, in terms of, democracy, I think maybe too big a word. That's a great point. But in the pilots, we did try a number of different ways, and democracy and media freedom were the ones that resonated people. They understood what we meant in the post-pilot surveys, et cetera. So that's why the language that we're using was sort of street tested, so to speak. Sylvia?
Thanks. Amazing to see it over and over again. I love it. Every time I learn something new. So I had a couple of questions. So the first thing I was really trying to think about is how do you want us to think about in the field experiment about the effect of having just a conversation with the canvassers versus the effect of information, given that you don't really have the power to distinguish between the basic information treatment and the research treatment. And in my personal experience and also relative to the literature, even just having a conversation can sway your vote. And so that seems interesting for me from a point of view of policy relevance. The second thing I was trying to wrap my head around is how do you want us to think about how do people in Turkey, particular supporter of Erdogan, see research? Because at least in Italy, starting a conversation saying, research says X is not the best way to win support of far-right voters, and actually got me, in my personal experience, a lot of screaming, running door-to-door campaigns in Italy. And so maybe this is also interesting here and important to flag that instead the research treatment seems to have an effect. And so I wonder whether this suggests that people in Turkey still trust research and researchers more than in other populist contexts. And then sort of the last thing related to that, how do you want us to think about the selection that the canvassers made between leaving the pamphlet and starting the conversation? At least in my experience, you have a bad conversation in a building, you don't want to have any more other conversations, you just leave the pamphlets. And so that might contribute to the downward bias because maybe they're shying away from the more important, harder to have conversation that might also have the largest treatment effects.
So those are all excellent points, Sylvia. So let me clarify that the numbers I showed you throughout are intention to treat. So they only compare treated neighborhoods to non-treated neighborhoods. So they don't try to channel it through those separate things. And there are three separate categories. You go there, you knock on the door, either nobody answers the door, in which case you leave the pamphlet. Or somebody answers the door, you start the conversation, but you cannot complete the conversation. They cut you off, and then you have to leave. Or you can do, and then again you leave the pamphlet. Or you start a conversation and you have a completed conversation. So first, on your third question, these people went through sort of a lengthy training that they had to do they had to knock on every door. And so to the best of our understanding with all the checks is that indeed they only left the pamphlet when they didn't get an answer. So it's not like they got discouraged and then let me try to finish it. But of course, some slippage may have occurred. It is exactly for that reason that I don't dwell so much on the two-stage least squares estimates, because whenever you choose one of those variables, the other two are in the background, so there is going to be a bias. So the only way, for example, you can have a causal effect of the completed conversations, which is that 2.2 that I reported, would be under the assumption that partially completed and pamphlets under the door have zero effects, which is a big assumption. Now, in terms of are people open to new data? Well, I wouldn't say that most of them are. So that's why I find these results very surprising. And again, if we only had the online experiments, I would say even despite our placebo, there is some sort of experimental demand effects here. But at the end of the day, the actual administrative data results suggest that there was some openness to it, perhaps because of that specific, very historic election where, the opposition wasn't just the CHP, but it was actually, I didn't say that, I should have said it. The opposition was a combination of 5 parties. And in addition to E Party, there was a religious party in the opposition, and then 2 other center-right parties. So perhaps that reduced the polarization to some extent, that some people became open to additional arguments. But that's why I think we have to do more of this type of things in other contexts as well. Andrea?
Thank you. So great stuff. I'm wondering, in this field we get quite a variety of results. So especially in the US, there are a lot of failed experiments, especially when you're trying to change perceptions, maybe you succeed, but when you try to affect votes, there are surveys that kind of argue that it's very, very, very hard. And so I'm curious to say if you can hypothesize as to why this worked out so well. Is it the fact that it was in an authoritarian context where perhaps...
That makes it harder, actually. That would probably make it harder. I think my only conjecture there, but it's an extremely hopeful one, meaning that I'm giving you the best case scenario, is that we did manage to make it appear as non-partisan as possible. And the canvassers were very professional. So we worked with very professional people. They trained the canvassers. The canvassers were supposed to be very respectful, allow people to speak, not push a particular point of view, and then the emphasis on research, the appeal to authority perhaps helped. But the only evidence I can show in favor of that is that weak and not quite statistically significant difference between non-affiliated canvassers and affiliated canvassers, and that's not enough to hang your hat on. Matteo?
Yeah, so this is another spin on a question that was already made about the definition of democracy and how it's difficult because it's multidimensional, of course, and you gave the answer that you tested these things, and so one of your treatments was about the media in particular, which is a very concrete aspect, no? But I would go further and say that there's something more difficult, which is that there's an inherent contradiction, no, in some aspects of democracy, right? So we have this understanding of democracy as the translating the majority of the will of people, right? And sort of like a complete opposite view, which is it's protecting a minority against the tyranny of the majority, right? And you can have these two things in mind to justify, lots of different things. So I would say that this idea of the tyranny of the majority, you could adapt very well into an authoritarian type of system. I'm wondering whether that is something that is done in Turkey and something that might also,
So those are great questions, Matteo. Thank you. And then it goes back to I forget your name, but Annie's question. So I think in general that's absolutely correct, and that's what I meant to expand on, but I didn't because I was worried about running out of time. Part of the reason why I showed that 5 dimensions of the VDEM index on the right, that all of them are going down, is that while there is in general this difference between different aspects of democracy, in Turkey all of them got worse. So all aspects of democracy got worse. And going back to your question, Annie, I think it's fairly objective, meaning that I think many different organizations using many different codings have done so. The media has been there's been a complete crackdown on the media. Opposition politicians have been jailed, parties have been closed, various barriers have been mounted against opposition parties. No sort of outright banning of elections, but short of that, there has been a lot of pressure against free and fair elections. And as a result, both the majoritarian dimension and sort of the liberal dimension of protection of minorities, civil rights, etc., have all weakened and pretty much in tandem. Yes, Jim.
So perhaps you convinced them of something a little different. Perhaps you convinced them it was safe to speak and vote their minds. There could be maybe a small fraction of Erdogan voters who actually think they're living in an even more authoritarian environment than they are. And seeing the pollsters come in or the canvassers come in and seeing the pamphlets convince them that, no, there's actually, it's not just a rumor. The opposition are really viable. And I can be against Erdogan, because I sort of already am, but I'm afraid of him, and I think they're seeing how I vote and so forth, because it's just a few percentage points. And we've seen this in other authoritarian environments where people really aren't sure about the integrity of the process, and they're intimidated.
Yeah, I think what troubled me, that the online effects are so big, actually goes a little bit against that. I mean, it's the 3.7%, and essentially about half of the voters. So it's a pretty big effect. But sure, it's an interesting. We can try to investigate that by looking at individual responses more. Yes, Chris? I have a bias towards people who are closer. I see those hands first. Sorry, I'll look at behind.
Okay, I'm not going to ask my small question, but later on we'll talk and I'll tell you why you might not want to use VDEM. But we on a day when a new pontiff was selected, we want Daron to pontificate. And sort of a bigger question that I think was a little bit behind what Anne and others were saying is, so democracy is a big word, and there's lots of varieties of democracy, but the only thing that's a bigger word is autocracy, right? Because so in some of your work in the initial regressions you showed, like that excluded category, the zeros, that ranges from Lee Kuan Yew to Idi Amin. And we know there are some high-performing autocracies. And so I'm just curious, stepping back from something like this, like how do you think about varieties of autocracy, and like what makes a high-performing autocracy? I know you like to say nothing, but
No. I mean, I think that's a fair question. But 2 questions you asked. The VDEM absolutely makes no difference. So we could have presented Freedom House. It's actually worse. Turkey's performance is even worse on Freedom House. So I don't, nothing hinges on VDEM. I thought that political scientists now like VDEM better. Our earlier work didn't use VDEM because it was before VDEM became so widely available and used. But in terms of successful autocracies, I think short-term success is much more common than long-term success. And Erdogan's economic performance, and especially causally related to his own policies, has been much bigger of a deal. And that's why we sort of think that there was, going back to Andrea's question, there was some openness perhaps to this, because pretty much everybody in Turkey sort of recognizes that 80-90% inflation, which is a big deal. People cannot afford stuff. They cut down their grocery budgets, etc., is a result of the policies that Erdogan has been pushing, like negative interest rate. I mean, in Turkey, at some point, interest rates were around -4. Real interest rates were around -40%. So I think that's the sense in which, for this setting, autocracy having bad economic performance would have been good, but we tried that, it still did not. That's the one where people thought, like, oh, we're confused about that, etc. So that's why we don't have that treatment at the end. So they resonated, they understood what democracy and natural disaster happens and you deal with it worse. That they understood that better. Yes, please?
So, cool, thanks. Now, I have a somewhat practical point. In the online experiment, you're able to move some people, not the majority, but some. So it seems to me that for people studying policy, and I happen to not be one of those, but nonetheless, we all live somewhere and are affected by policy. And so I'm wondering, can you, in the paper, tell us, profile who are the ones, what characteristics do those that you were able to move have? That's interesting, not just for the paper in general, and given that some papers cannot move anyone, never mind the voting, but even the preferences. But also, of course, thinking in a comparative context.
Great question. We haven't done that. We can do that. Good suggestion. Suti?
Thank you. I just want to go back to the arms race point and, in general, ask your view on the role of information interventions versus other interventions. So presumably, this is happening in a context where there is another side, which is flooding people with misinformation or contrary information to the researcher authoritative information. So my question is, if we wanted to think about why that status quo happened in the first place, why was misinformation propagating successfully in the first place, are there other institutional conditions that one could research and think about? So I'm sort of asking you a more general question, and in particular for Turkey, my lay understanding is the role of local elections. So do local government elections, and this is similar to Garance's point about schools and education. Another institutional setting is local government elections as a space in which the wrong type of leaders emerge, get selected through elections, and then begin to build this ecosystem of misinformation.
So
Thank you.
There are many issues to think about in that context, but I think in the Turkish context, the biggest thing, which goes a little bit to Matteo's earlier question, is that in 2000, the reality or the perception, and there was in equal measure probably, is that the sort of the more religious, conservative, small town groups felt silenced and weren't allowed, that they felt they weren't allowed to participate in politics as much. And that's the group that brought AKP, was the representative. There was a soft coup against a previous religious government 3 years prior to that. So that's the background to some people saying now things have become more democratic because we can speak. We couldn't speak before. That's a complete exaggeration, but there is some grain of truth to that. Yes? Oh. Right. So the Turkish person with real information who wants to ask a question. And I think we have only 3 minutes left, so
okay.
I'll take more question after this.
So my question is on the canvassers. So you couldn't convince the AKP, but I'm pretty sure they're also leaving pamphlets. Have you looked into that? And
no, we don't have any
how does it compare? Do you think you improved how the CHP and other parties were approaching? As well as, I'm curious about the beliefs of people you're surveying. Did you ask them, did they think their party could succeed or not? Because I'm wondering if the difference in that 2024, the result you're seeing is because maybe they didn't believe they could win going into 2023, but once they see the result, they're more confident in the result. And finally, how do we come back from this deterioration of institution in Turkey and other countries?
I think it's, on the last one, it's much harder when authoritarianism intensifies. So, fixing perceptions of democracy is much harder. So I don't have a good answer for the last one. So I was trying to turn that more into a positive one by focusing on places where there's still democracy, like Clemence was saying, like in France, for example. In terms of, I think the context was that a lot of the opposition mistakenly thought they could actually win the 2024 election, but I don't know whether it was. One final question, please.
So I'm just curious about the specific language that you're using and if you've been able to look into if using different language has better versus worse effects. Because, like, for instance, I know that particularly in this country, if you try to reach out to Trump supporters and you use certain language, you can get them to ignore you. You can get them to sometimes lie to you about what their voting intentions are. God forbid you post an article on Twitter with the headline "Experts Say." Yes. All right, the comments will not be positive. So I'm just curious if you've been able to look and do certain types of messaging, whether it's populist messaging or kind of like Mark Carney style, just straight the facts. Yeah. Are there any types of messages that have a better effect than others?
Yeah, I think once the expertise becomes politicized, then doing an intervention like this would be much harder. In Turkey, things are very polarized, but I guess when you say data show, etc., with some authority, people still paid some attention to that. But again, one should do much more on that. Thank you.